You've probably heard of people turning small investments into Lambos with crypto, all while you're just figuring out where to even start. Stocks, crypto, both. In 2025, it's more confusing than ever, and picking the wrong one could waste years of progress. So in this video, I'm breaking down the real differences, the risk, the reward, and how to think about it if you're just getting started. Welcome to the channel, friends. Markets are really volatile at the moment. We had a period where it was just going down, and now we have a very nice bounce going on. And this is across all of the markets, not just the US stock market. It's the same story with Bitcoin, it's the same story with many other assets. And if you've not started investing, you're probably wondering where to even get started. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about investing in stocks, I'm going to be talking about investing in crypto, and I'll also cover things to take into consideration when making the decision in what to do. And I'll tell you what I do as well. When we look at the stock market, generally everyone looks at the S&P 500 because this is generally how the overall markets perform. This is solely the US economy, but generally other economies do follow what the US do. And that's why every investor that invests in the stock market, they look at the S&P 500, which is this chart over here. You could see going back from 2010 all the way until today, the overall trend is up. So the stock market generally over time, it goes up. And if we look at the historical returns for the S&P 500 since way before the World War, then you could see there's more blue, so there's more positive years compared to the red, which is the negative years. And if you were to scroll down and look at all of these numbers in terms of the percentage return, the average would sit somewhere between 8 to 10% every single year the S&P 500 has delivered. The other thing with stocks is that it's easier to understand and value. If I look at Apple, it's easier because I can have a look at lots of different metrics. So for example, I can look at how much revenue they make every year, and I can get a breakdown if I wanted as well and see how much they actually make in terms of iPhone sales, such as this chart over here. And there's lots of different valuation metrics, ratios, and things that I can look at with Apple. And furthermore, there's long research articles about different companies. So for example, here's a report by Morningstar on Apple. So they rate it as a 3-star company. They say their fair value is about $200. They got a wide moat, and there's so much more that you can read. So there's 24 pages of content which you can read on Apple and help you make a decision in terms of whether Apple is overvalued or undervalued. You can see things like their earnings, their cash flow, their business model, and there's just so much that you can do. The other thing with stocks in general is that it's regulated. They're well established, they've been around for a long time. So for example, you've seen already with the S&P 500, we're talking since the year 1926. It's been around for almost a century now. So it's got that track record in terms of how long it's been there for, and to yield 7 to 10% every single year for that amount of time, it is something that would be fairly safe. The disadvantages to stocks is that it's slower in compounding compared to crypto. 8 to 10% a year in terms of the S&P 500 versus crypto such as Bitcoin, which generally outperforms the S&P 500. And I'll show you when I go on to Bitcoin. And the other disadvantage with the S&P 500 is that during market crashes, there is a lot of volatility. So for example, recently when Trump announced the tariffs, there's a lot of volatility. The S&P 500, it dropped about 20%. And similarly in 2022, the S&P 500 dropped 26%. And even in COVID, it had a sharp decline of about 35%. Investing in stocks is not the safest thing in the world. There will be volatility, as with most other investments. But generally speaking, when you do zoom out, the overall trend is up. The other disadvantage to stocks is that when they do move, when there is a lot of upside, it's less explosive compared to crypto. If you're good enough to pick individual stocks, then they can make those explosive moves. But if I just compare against the S&P 500 over here, since the market started recovering, the market is up about 16% for the S&P 500. Whereas with crypto, it's more than that. Now next up, when we look at crypto, specifically I'll be looking at Bitcoin. Bitcoin only really came out after the financial crisis, so about 2008 to 2009. That's when Bitcoin first came out, and it started being traded more commonly after the year 2012 or so, and that's when it's had its first explosive moves. So the first thing you'll notice with Bitcoin is that it doesn't have the track record that stocks has. Stocks have been around for about a century, whereas with Bitcoin, it's just over a decade that it's been out for. Bitcoin and crypto, it does come with advantages though. The first thing is when there is upside, is much more explosive compared to stocks. So if I look at the 2022 lows, the bear market, Bitcoin recovered and is now currently up over 570%, Whereas in that same time frame, so if I go on the S&P 500 and I go to the 2022 lows to today, is 62%. So we got 62% over here in the S&P 500, and then we got 572% in Bitcoin. So when the volatility is there, when the upside is there for Bitcoin, then it's much more compared to stocks. The second thing with Bitcoin is that it's a 24/7 market. So I can trade Bitcoin any time of the day. There's no opening time, there's no closing bell, it's just available to invest. Whereas with stocks, it's only Monday to Friday, it's about 8 o'clock till 4 o'clock, or I think 9 o'clock till 5 o'clock. So stocks, they have fixed hours. I can't trade it on the weekend, and there's a lot of stuff that generally does happen over the weekend. So if there's some new news coming out in the weekend and you need to take action ASAP, then unfortunately you can't do that. Whereas with something like crypto, you can do that. The other advantage is that there's growing institutional interest. So recently there's a new ETF that came out called IBIT, which is a Bitcoin ETF. So there is big players pouring into the space for Bitcoin. The disadvantages to Bitcoin is, number one, with the volatility in the upside being much more explosive, it's the same thing in the downside. So for example, Bitcoin, it went from its recent highs to the lows when Trump announced his tariffs, which was about 31% down, whereas the S&P 500 was about 22% down. So the downside potential with Bitcoin is much higher compared to stocks. So the volatility works in both ways. And the second thing with Bitcoin is that it's still early days. So you've seen that it's only been around for just over a decade. Now, to further illustrate this, if I was to show you the total market cap for the stock market in the US in general is about $50 trillion. Whereas if we look at crypto as a whole, every single crypto out there, there's about 15 million cryptos. The total market cap that it makes up is 3.3 trillion. So 3.3 trillion versus $50 trillion. Crypto is much more smaller. And if we look at Bitcoin specifically, from that 3 trillion, Bitcoin makes up 2 trillion of it. So Bitcoin is the biggest play when it comes to cryptocurrency, and Bitcoin in fact is bigger in terms of market cap compared to most of the biggest companies out there. It's bigger than Amazon, Google, Broadcom, etc. The other disadvantage with crypto is when people talk about crypto, they generally talk about Bitcoin. However, when you're new to crypto, you'll notice that a lot of newbies, they tend to invest in altcoins. And when I say altcoins, I talk about coins that are very low down on this list over here, very small market cap. And these coins, they do not perform the same way as Bitcoin. If you were to pull up the chart of Bitcoin and see how much it's grown since 2022 versus most of these other altcoins, you'll see that most of the altcoins underperform Bitcoin. So one of the mistakes people make is that they invest in these altcoins, especially when they're new. The evidence shows, when really the historic price patterns show, that Bitcoin generally outperforms most of the other altcoins. So things that you should be taking into consideration when you're considering between stocks and crypto is things like, beyond the things that I've mentioned already, are things like taxes. So here in the UK, depending on how much you earn, the profit that you'll actually make on crypto will either get a 24% tax or an 18% tax on the profits that we make. Especially if you're here, that is a lot of money that goes from your profits. So you're taking increased risk by investing in crypto, and majority of the profits that you make will end up going in taxes. Whereas if you were to stick with stocks, then if you were to use something like an ISA account, then you'll be paying zero tax. There is no 24% that you need to pay from your profits. So any money that you make is literally pure profit. So that's one of the things that you need to take into consideration. Of course, other countries, they have their own rules, so just double check that wherever you are. The other thing that you need to take into consideration is how safe your money will be. Investing in crypto is hard. It's not as easy as people make it. Yes, it's high risk and there's high reward. However, hacking and scams, they're very common. Hacks happen all the time in crypto, like Ronin Network, $625 million stolen, Poly Network stolen, BNB Bridge, money, they get lost all the time in crypto. And so if you're not careful and if you're not critical in terms of where you actually invest, there's a chance that you lose your money as well. So that's another thing that you need to take into account. Whereas something like stocks is more simple to invest in. Generally, they're regulated markets, so there's less chances of you losing money. Obviously, if you invest in something that does go down, then it goes down. But in terms of hacks and things like that, generally here in the UK, there is compensation that's available if an exchange or something that was regulated becomes bankrupt. But it's not all doom and gloom. Companies like BlackRock, one of the biggest asset manager in the world, they say that Bitcoin has a place in multi-asset portfolios. So they say that giving Bitcoin a 1 to 2% weighting in your portfolio is something that is recommended, but anything more than that, then it's risky. So if you think of crypto and Bitcoin as something like, you know, when you're having a meal, you have your stocks as your main meal, but then in terms of your cream on the top or the spicing on the top, that would be your crypto. What a lot of the newbies do is they see people on social media that have done really good in crypto, in which there's a lot of people that have done good in crypto, but they say that, okay, they did it, so it will be the same for me. The only thing that I'll say to that is you'll probably get 1 in 10 people that make a really good life from crypto, and you'll hear about that. But then there'll always be the 9 out of 10 people that you won't hear about that actually lost their money. So after all of this, the next question is, where does it lie for me? What do I do? What's my plan? So from my videos, I'm mainly focused on stocks, but I also have an allocation to crypto. I think crypto is definitely worth having, especially if you're young, because if you have stocks and you make a 10 to 20% gain, it's great if you do that consistently for the long term. But in the short term, if you need your money within 5 years, the 10% per year gain that you've probably made from stocks is good, but it's probably not amazing or life-changing. Whereas if you had bought crypto, say in 2022, and it goes up over 500%, as someone young, that would be much more life-changing compared to anything else. And for that reason, I say that crypto, it should be part of the portfolio for pretty much everyone. However, the main focus should be on stocks. And if you were to invest in crypto, then sticking to the high market cap cryptos, the one that I would mention is Bitcoin. If you found this video useful, please like and subscribe. And if you want to see what I hold in my stocks portfolio, please click this video over here. Thank you.